For 12 years, nobody asked where the money went. That was the strange part. People asked about the chickens. They asked about egg prices. They asked about feed costs. They asked why Margaret Hale spent every Saturday sitting behind a roadside table selling eggs. Nobody asked where the money went. If they had, the entire county would have discovered the truth much sooner. The egg stand sat beside a 2-lane highway just outside town. Nothing fancy. A wooden table. A small roof. A hand-painted sign. Fresh farm eggs. Every morning before sunrise, Margaret stocked coolers with eggs and arranged dozens of cartons across the display. By 7 o'clock, customers started arriving. Local families, travelers, restaurant owners, retirees. Everybody knew the stand. Everybody knew Margaret. And everybody believed they understood her. That was their first mistake. One summer morning, Dale Harper pulled his truck onto the gravel shoulder. He climbed out holding a coffee cup. Margaret was arranging cartons. As usual, Dale grinned. There she is. Margaret looked up. Morning. Dale picked up a carton, examined it dramatically, then nodded. Still selling eggs. Silence. Then, yes. Big plans. Margaret smiled slightly. Always. Dale laughed. Like what? Long pause. Then, land. Dale nearly spilled his coffee. Land. Yes. From eggs. Yes. The answer made him laugh even harder. Because to Dale Harper, and most of the county, the idea sounded ridiculous. The Hale farm originally consisted of 80 acres. Good land. Not exceptional. Not large. Just enough. Margaret inherited it from her grandfather Samuel Hale, a man who viewed land differently than everyone else. One autumn evening, when Margaret was 14, she followed Samuel along a fence line overlooking neighboring farms. The sunset painted the fields gold. Several properties stretched toward the horizon. Samuel pointed across the valley. See all that? Margaret nodded. Yes. Long pause. Then, what about it? Samuel smiled. Most people think they're looking at land. Silence. Then, what are they looking at? Time. The answer made no sense. At least not then. Samuel noticed her confusion, then laughed. Land's the only thing that keeps working while you sleep. That lesson stayed. Years later, it became everything. After Samuel passed away, Margaret inherited more than farmland. She inherited notebooks. Hundreds of them. Property records. Tax records. Auction notices. Financial journals. Everything. One notebook fascinated her. Because Samuel tracked neighboring properties obsessively. Ownership changes. Estate settlements. Bank foreclosures. Retirement sales. Every transaction. At first, Margaret thought it was strange. Then she noticed a pattern. Whenever land became available, Samuel paid attention. Not always. Not emotionally. Patiently. The lesson remained. Years later, Margaret started raising laying hens. Originally, because the farm needed additional income. The first flock was small. Very small. The profits were modest. But something interesting happened. People paid cash. Every day. Every week. Every month. Small amounts. Consistently. Most farmers ignored small amounts. Margaret didn't. Because Samuel taught her something else. Big fortunes often arrive disguised as small transactions. The egg stand grew. Not dramatically. Steadily. 50 hens became 100. 100 became 300. Then 500. The county noticed. Naturally. One afternoon at the diner, Dale pointed toward the highway. Margaret's egg stand sat visible through the window. There she is. Rick looked up. The egg lady? Dale nodded. The egg lady. Laughter spread around the table. Not cruel. Just casual. Comfortable. The kind people use when they think they've figured someone out. Nobody discussed land. Nobody discussed finances. Nobody discussed what Margaret did after market hours. Because nobody knew. 3 years after starting the stand, a neighboring 20-acre parcel became available. An elderly couple retired. Their children moved away. The land went up for sale. Margaret bought it. Quietly. Most people never noticed. For years later, another parcel appeared. 40 acres. Margaret bought that too. Quietly. Again, nobody paid attention. Because people rarely notice things happening slowly. One evening, Emily Hale sat across from Margaret at the kitchen table. Property maps covered every available surface. Deeds. Tax records. Survey plats. Everything. Emily looked around. You're doing it again. Margaret looked up. What? The maps. Silence. The maps. That means you're thinking. Long pause. Then. Yes. Emily sighed. Dangerous. Very dangerous. What kind of thinking? Margaret pointed toward a highlighted boundary. 80 acres. Emily immediately smiled. Buy. Maybe. That answer usually meant yes. The pattern continued. Year after year, egg sales flowed steadily. Expenses remained controlled. Profits accumulated. And whenever a neighboring property became available, Margaret paid attention. Not every parcel. Only the right ones. Only when the numbers worked. Patience became the strategy. The county remained unaware. Mostly because people preferred simpler explanations. They saw eggs. Therefore they saw egg money. Small money. Simple money. Comforting money. Reality looked very different. One spring morning, a local bank auction attracted half the county. A struggling operation had failed. 200 acres went up for sale. Good ground. Productive ground. Everybody wanted it. The auction room filled quickly. Farmers. Investors. Developers. Speculators. Everyone. Margaret sat quietly near the back. As usual, most people barely noticed. Why would they? She sold eggs. The bidding started aggressively. Prices climbed. Then climbed again. One by one bidders dropped out. Eventually, only two remained. A regional investor. And Margaret Hale. The room became quieter. Then quieter still. The investor raised his bid. Margaret responded immediately. Another bid. Another response. The investor hesitated. Then stopped. The auctioneer raised his hammer. Sold. Silence. Absolute silence. Then somebody whispered. The egg lady? The room turned. Because suddenly a very uncomfortable thought appeared. Nobody actually knew how much money Margaret Hale had. The question started after that. Slowly. Then faster. Because over the following years Margaret kept buying. 20 acres. 40 acres. 60 acres. Another 80. Another 100. The acreage expanded quietly across the county. Most people noticed pieces. Nobody saw the whole picture. Until one rainy afternoon when a title company employee started updating ownership maps and accidentally discovered something that would leave the entire county speechless. The discovery happened by accident. Nobody was investigating Margaret Hale. Nobody suspected anything. Nobody even asked the question. A title company employee named Brian Foster was simply updating ownership maps. Routine work. Property transfers. Boundary adjustments. Tax records. The usual. Then he noticed something strange. The same name kept appearing. Again, and again, and again. Hale, Hale, Hale. At first he assumed it was coincidence. The county contained plenty of Hale relatives. But eventually curiosity won. Brian started tracing parcels. One map became two. Two became three. Soon large sections of the county spread across his desk. Colored markers highlighted ownership. Parcel numbers filled notebooks. The acreage total kept climbing. 200 acres. 400. 600. 800. Then more. Brian stopped. Checked his math. Then checked it again. Because surely he'd made a mistake. Surely. The final number sat there plainly. 1,200 acres. Paid off. No mortgages. No bank debt. No investment partners. No corporate ownership. Just Margaret Hale. The egg lady. Brian stared at the map. Then did what every small-town employee eventually does. He told somebody. By lunchtime 5 people knew. By supper 50 people knew. By the following morning, the entire county knew. The reaction followed a predictable pattern. First disbelief. Then confusion. Then embarrassment. Because suddenly everyone realized something uncomfortable. They'd spent 12 years talking about Margaret. Without understanding anything about her. The diner exploded first. Naturally, Dale Harper walked through the door, carrying a county ownership map. Then dropped it onto a table. No. Rick looked up. What? Dale pointed dramatically. No. Silence. What? Margaret. Long pause. What about Margaret? Dale unfolded the map. Colored sections stretched across multiple townships. Every highlighted parcel belonged to the same owner. The room became quiet. Very quiet. Then, no. Yes. No. Yes. Rick leaned forward. Then froze. 1,200. Dale nodded. Debt-free. Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Because suddenly every joke about eggs felt different. One Saturday morning Margaret arrived at the roadside stand. Same truck. Same coolers. Same cartons. Nothing had changed. Except the customers. People stared. A lot. Margaret noticed immediately. Of course she did. She'd spent years reading people. Dale arrived 20 minutes later. Naturally, he climbed out of his truck. Walked directly to the stand. Picked up a carton. Set it down. Long silence. Finally, you own 1,200 acres? Margaret smiled slightly. Yes. Silence. Then, Why didn't you tell anybody? That question followed her everywhere afterward. At church, at the feed store, at the co-op, at the diner, everywhere. Everyone wanted the same answer. Why didn't you tell us? Margaret never understood the confusion, because from her perspective, nothing had changed. One evening, Emily sat beside her on the porch overlooking rolling fields. Much of the visible horizon belonged to the Hale family now. Not through inheritance, not through luck, purchase by purchase, year after year. Emily looked toward the sunset. They really had no idea. Margaret laughed softly. No. Long pause. Then, why didn't you tell them? Margaret looked across the land, then shrugged. Nobody asked. That answer became famous, mostly because it annoyed people. 1 month later, the County Agricultural Association invited Margaret to speak, something they had never done before. The meeting hall filled quickly. Farmers packed every chair. People stood against walls. Everyone wanted answers. Margaret stood at the front looking uncomfortable. Public speaking ranked somewhere below drought and equipment breakdowns on her list of favorite activities. The association president smiled. Everybody wants to know how you did it. Margaret blinked. Did what? The room laughed. Because apparently she still didn't understand why people were fascinated. The president pointed toward the audience. The land. Silence. Then, oh, long pause. Slowly, the room laughed again. Margaret wasn't joking. She continued. One payment at a time. Nobody wrote that down. They expected something dramatic. A secret investment strategy. A hidden inheritance. Some complicated financial trick. Instead, Margaret explained exactly what happened. She sold eggs. Saved profits. Bought land when opportunities appeared. Repeated the process. For 12 years. One farmer finally raised his hand. What was the secret? Margaret frowned. Secret. Yes. Silence. Then, there wasn't one. The room grew quiet. Because deep down, everyone knew she was telling the truth. The strategy sounded boring. Patience. Discipline. Consistency. The things people rarely celebrate because they take too long. Another farmer stood. How much money did the egg stand really make? Margaret smiled. Enough. Laughter filled the room. But she continued. People underestimate daily cash flow. Silence. Then, what do you mean? Margaret pointed toward the audience. Everybody looks for one big opportunity. Long pause. I looked for 10,000 small ones. That answer stayed with people, because it explained everything. One carton, then another, then another. One customer, then another, then another. 1 acre, then another, then another. The process never looked impressive while it was happening. Only afterward. Years later, the county still talked about it. Not because of the acreage, because of the lesson. One autumn evening, Dale stood beside Margaret overlooking hundreds of acres of pasture, cropland, and timber. The setting sun painted everything gold. The roadside egg stand remained visible in the distance. Tiny, almost insignificant. Dale folded his arms. You know what still bothers me? Margaret smiled slightly. What? He pointed toward the stand. We called you the egg lady. Yes. No, seriously. Long pause. For 12 years. Margaret looked toward the horizon. Then back. That's all right. Silence. Then. Why? She smiled. Because I was the egg lady. The answer surprised him. Because it was true. She never pretended otherwise. The egg stand wasn't a disguise. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a secret. It was simply one piece of a larger plan nobody bothered to notice. For 12 years, the county saw Margaret Hale sitting beside a highway selling eggs from a wooden table. They saw cartons, coolers, chickens, small cash sales. They thought they understood everything. Meanwhile, Margaret quietly paid off neighboring parcels. One farm, then another, then another. Not because she chased attention, because she believed what Samuel taught her years earlier. Land was time. And while everyone laughed at the woman selling eggs by the road, she was quietly becoming one of the largest debt-free landowners in the entire county. One carton at a time.